Two siblings, Jacob and Lila, have just scraped together $510, their last savings, to bid on a dusty, forgotten storage unit in the Nevada desert. What looks like a pile of broken furniture and moldy boxes hides a secret that will change their lives forever. As they uncover an old chest and mysterious artifacts, their adventure becomes a dangerous quest for truth, history, and courage. If you love thrilling emotional stories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It drummed endlessly on the roof of Jacob Navarro's old Ford, pooling in the cracks of the windshield, where tape had failed to keep it sealed. The air inside smelled faintly of gasoline and instant coffee, his life distilled into fumes. Lila slept in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the glass breath, leaving faint circles of fog that came and went like whispers. Jacob watched her for a long moment, the way her shoulders trembled even in sleep. The heater had quit an hour ago, but he didn't have the strength to fix it. Outside, Bakersfield's edge bled into flat, wet land. They had been here before, parked at the edge of nowhere, pretending this was a rest stop and not their home. 3 months earlier, their father's construction business had collapsed, dragging their lives down with it. The hospital bills that followed his heart attack had finished the job. Their mother's name had disappeared from the lease after she left town to live with a distant cousin. All that was left were 2 twins, 29 years old, carrying debts that weren't theirs and dreams they couldn't afford. Jacob worked day labor when he could, hauling crates for a warehouse that hadn't called him in 2 weeks. Lila's job at a diner barely kept gas in the truck. At night, they slept sitting up, taking turns pretending things would turn around. When morning broke, the storm left behind air sharp with the smell of wet asphalt. Lila woke first, combing her hair with her fingers. "You look awful," she said softly. Jacob smiled weakly. "You're not exactly a calendar girl yourself." She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a crumpled newspaper. "Look," she said, pointing to an ad circled in red pen. "Storage auction abandoned units. Bring cash. You keep what you find." Jacob laughed, the sound dry as dust. "You think treasure's hiding behind a bunch of old boxes?" "Maybe not treasure," she said, "but something. Anything." By noon, they were standing in a sun-baked lot on the edge of town. Rows of dented metal doors stretched into the distance, each holding someone's forgotten life. The crowd was mostly older men with trucks, women with clipboards, the kind of people who made side money off other people's losses. The auctioneer, a wiry man in a Stetson, shouted through a megaphone, "No touching, no entering, cash only." He rolled up the first door. Inside, rotting furniture and water-stained cardboard. The crowd grumbled. Next, Lila stood close beside Jacob, her hands hidden in her sleeves. When the 5th door rolled open, the crowd groaned again. A torn mattress, broken lamp, scattered papers. No one bid. 100, the auctioneer called. Silence. 50-0. Lila raised her hand. 40? Heads turned. Sold, the man said, almost laughing. To the lady with courage or bad eyesight, a ripple of laughter followed, but Lila didn't blink. Jacob followed her inside. The smell of mold hit him like a slap. They started sorting old tools, faded Polaroids, children's shoes tax forms from the 1980s. "We just bought someone's trash," he muttered. Lila didn't answer. She was crouched near the back wall, brushing dust off something flat and wooden. A board nailed awkwardly against the concrete, its edges newer than everything around it. She knocked it gently hollow. "Help me," she said. Jacob fetched a rusted crowbar and pried at the corners. Nails shrieked, dust rained down, and behind the board was a small metal plate set into the wall. It was a lock, round, tarnished with initials etched faintly into the metal. "EC." Lila ran her fingers across it the way one might touch a gravestone. "What do you think it opens?" she asked. Jacob shrugged, but something in his chest tightened, the faint tremor of possibility. Maybe nothing, he said, though his voice didn't sound certain. They carried the plate to the truck. The desert evening stretched wide and gold, the kind of light that made even broken things look holy. Lila held the lock in her palm, turning it over as if expecting it to warm her fingers. "Do you think the person who owned that unit was hiding something? She asked quietly. Jacob started the engine. If they were, they didn't do a great job keeping it. But his eyes kept glancing at the lock on the dashboard. That night they parked behind a shuttered gas station. The stars came out clear, the first they'd seen in days. Lila traced the initials again, whispering, EC. Jacob didn't ask why. He watched the glow of passing semis cut through the dark and felt something strange, a tug he couldn't name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the need to believe there was still something left for them in this world besides debt and disappointment. When he finally closed his eyes, the sound of the rain had been replaced by silence. The kind that isn't empty, but waiting. The next morning, the desert sky hung low and white, a bleached sheet stretched tight across the sun. Jacob and Lila parked their truck beside the storage unit once more, their breath visible in the chill. The lock they had found the night before lay on the dashboard, glinting faintly, as if it wanted to be noticed. They had spent most of the night talking about it in hushed voices about what it could mean, who EC might have been, and whether any of it was worth caring about when they barely had enough money to fill the gas tank. But curiosity had a way of turning hunger into energy. That morning they decided to go back. The auctioneer barely glanced up when they arrived. "You kids here to clear your junk? Got till 5 before I close up." Jacob nodded, gripping the envelope that held everything they had left, $510 in cash, their last chance to stay afloat. Lila had convinced him to use it to officially claim the unit for another month in case whatever they had found led to something more. "We're not done with it yet," she'd said. And though the logic was fragile, Jacob couldn't argue. Inside, the unit looked smaller now. The daylight revealed details they hadn't seen before, the faint water stains crawling up the walls, the soft hum of flies circling near the ceiling. The air was dense with the smell of mildew and old paper. Jacob set up their small battery lamp on a metal chair and rolled up his sleeves. "Let's start from the back," he said. Lila tied her hair into a knot and began pulling boxes into the light. Each one felt like a small disappointment, old magazines, tarnished silverware, brittle Christmas ornaments still dusted with fake snow. "People keep everything," she murmured, half to herself, "even when it's already gone." Hours passed. Dust clung to their clothes, to their hair, to their lungs. They found a cassette player with corroded batteries, a broken clock, a child's blanket embroidered with the name Evelyn. Jacob placed it aside carefully. "Maybe that's our EC," he said. "Evelyn. Carter Coleman." Lila shrugged but pocketed the name, storing it in her mind, the way she used to memorize diner orders quickly, completely. When Jacob turned to move an old dresser, the floor underneath creaked sharply. "Careful," Lila warned, but he had already pulled too hard. The back panel of the dresser tore loose, revealing a section of wall behind it, rough concrete, slightly uneven. The light from the lamp struck the surface and cast a narrow shadow where the wall bulged outward, just enough to notice. Lila crouched beside it and touched the curve with her fingertips. "Feel that," she whispered. The cement was cold and strangely smooth. Jacob leaned closer. "It's like someone poured over something," he said, "like they sealed it." The two of them stared at the bulge for a long moment before Lila fetched a small hammer from the tool pile. The first tap echoed softly, the sound hollow and thin. She glanced at Jacob. "That's not solid," he hesitated. "You think it's a compartment or a grave," she said lightly, though her tone lacked humor. He almost smiled despite himself. Together, they began chipping away the top layer of plaster. The dust rose in slow gray clouds that made their eyes sting. Beneath the outer coating, they found a patch of darker cement, a deliberate repair, rougher and newer than the surrounding wall. It was as if someone had built a tiny doorway, then buried it alive. Lila's hand trembled slightly as she brushed away debris. "Whoever did this didn't want it found," she said. Which means Jacob answered quietly, "It's probably worth finding." They worked in silence after that. The rhythm of the hammer became steady, the dull thud blending with the occasional metallic ping. After half an hour, Jacob struck something different, A sound like metal scraping against stone. They froze. Lila leaned forward, using her fingers to clear the dust. The shape that emerged made her breath catch. Embedded in the concrete was a corroded keyhole, circular, sealed by rust, surrounded by faint etchings that might once have been letters. "It's the same design as the lock," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out the metal plate they had found the night before. When he held it up, the pieces seemed to mirror each other perfectly. The shape, the edges, even the worn brass patterning. "It fits here," he said slowly. Lila looked up, eyes wide, with the kind of hope that hurt to feel. "Then maybe it opens," she said. They tried cleaning the surface, scraping away residue with an old screwdriver. When Jacob pressed the plate against the embedded keyhole, it clicked faintly, a sound so delicate they almost missed it. But nothing moved. The lock stayed dead, sealed by time and silence. Lila sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "Maybe there's another piece," she said. "Or maybe it's just decoration." Jacob studied the wall. "No one buries decoration under cement," he said. The light inside the unit dimmed as the afternoon sun began to fall. Their shadows stretched long across the floor, thin and uncertain. "We need real tools," Jacob said finally. "A chisel, maybe a drill. I can borrow one from the warehouse if they'll let me." Lila nodded, still staring at the lock. Her voice was distant when she finally spoke. "What if whatever's behind there changes everything?" He looked at her carefully. "Changes what?" "The way we've been living," she said simply. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the dry smell of the desert through the rows of storage doors. Jacob locked the unit and placed the key in his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the plate once more. It felt heavier now, as though it had absorbed the weight of their questions. As they walked toward the truck, neither of them spoke. The evening light made their breath visible again, two thin ghosts fading into the air. When they reached the truck, Jacob glanced back one last time at the row of silent units, the fading numbers on each door. He could still see in his mind the slight bulge in the wall, the way the cement had seemed to hide something breathing beneath it. He started the engine, but Lila's hand stopped him. "Jake," she said softly. "What if we weren't supposed to find it?" He didn't answer. The truck's headlights flared against the metal doors, catching the faint glint of something deep inside the unit, something neither of them had noticed before watching them, even as they drove away. The next morning, the sun climbed slowly over the Bakersfield horizon, painting the storage lot in pale gold. Jacob and Lila returned to the unit with a quiet determination, carrying a borrowed hand truck and a small toolbox. The air smelled of dust and sun-baked metal, and the faint hum of distant traffic filled the space between the rows of storage doors. Jacob set down the hand truck and lifted the rusted plate from the dashboard, examining it once more. The initials EC caught the light, faint scratches glinting in the morning sun. He tapped it against the concrete wall, where the embedded keyhole waited a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. Lila crouched beside him, dusting away the thin layer of dirt with careful fingers. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. He had no idea if this would lead to disappointment or discovery, but the small pulse of hope had grown stronger overnight, refusing to be ignored. They worked slowly, chiseling away at the cement and plaster with meticulous care. Each tap released a cloud of fine gray dust that settled over their hands and faces. The sun climbed higher, warming their skin, yet the effort left them chilled in the sweat of anticipation. Jacob's knuckles whitened around the hammer as he chipped a corner loose, revealing a dark hollow beyond. Lila's eyes widened. She reached forward, her hands trembling as she brushed away the remaining debris. Behind the wall, they uncovered a rectangular metal box, thick and heavy, nearly 20 kilograms. The corners were reinforced, the surface scarred by time and oxidation. Jacob let out a slow breath. "Here it is," he said. "Whatever it is, it's here." Lila knelt beside the box, resting her palms lightly on its surface. The metal was cold, as if it had absorbed the history of whatever it had contained. Jacob fetched a small crowbar and began prying the lid. It resisted at first, grating against rust and age, but with careful pressure, it finally gave way with a deep, resonant click. Dust and the faint scent of oil rose from inside, filling the cramped space with an almost tangible anticipation. They leaned in together. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were 9 Spanish gold coins gleaming faintly even under the harsh morning light. Each bore a date 1739. The designs were intricate, depicting royal coats of arms ships at sea and symbols of the Spanish crown. The coins were heavier than Jacob expected, the cold weight in his palm shocking against the warmth of the air around them. He glanced at Lila. 9, he whispered. 9 gold coins from nearly 3 centuries ago. Beneath the coins lay a small, leather-bound journal, edges charred corners, brittle from age. Lila picked it up delicately, turning the pages with reverence. The handwriting inside was precise, measured, written in ink that had faded to a warm brown. On the first page she read aloud, "La gracia no es el oro sino lo que perdimos buscando no." Her voice trembled slightly, the words hanging in the dusty sunlight. Jacob leaned in, following the letters with his finger. He translated slowly. "Grace is not in the gold, but in what we lost seeking it." The significance hit them both like a blow. The journal was more than a record. It was a message, a moral embedded in time, a reminder that history carried emotion as much as treasure. Lila traced the sentence with her thumb, imagining the person who had written it. He meant this as a warning, she said. Or maybe a lesson. At the very bottom of the box, folded neatly, was a black and white photograph. Jacob held it up to the light. It showed a man, tall and thin, with a sun-worn face holding the hand of a small girl in a wide-brimmed hat. They stood in the desert wind, scattering their clothing. The man's eyes were kind, almost sorrowful, and the girl looked up at him with trust and innocence. Lila swallowed hard. "That's him," she said softly. E.C. Jacob nodded, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. The photograph captured a moment suspended between hope and danger, a memory of a life that had intersected with these objects in ways they could barely comprehend. He felt an unspoken connection to the man and child, as if the desert itself had held them in waiting until the right hands arrived. The journal pages were brittle under Lila's careful touch. Each line was deliberate, each annotation a meticulous record of travel observations and small personal notes tucked between logistical instructions. Mentions of desert landmarks, water sources, and distant settlements created a map within the text one that intertwined with the coins and photograph, as though each object had been curated with care to tell a story. Jacob ran his finger over a faint pencil sketch of mountains' peaks rising in jagged shapes that could only belong to the arid West. He traced the lines, imagining the sweat and sunburn endured by the person who had marked them. Lila's eyes lingered on the margins where tiny flourishes indicated emphasis, little reminders, or perhaps signs of affection for someone who would never see them again. Hours passed unnoticed. The box sat between them like a fragile treasure chest, but more than gold, it was the history of someone's life compressed into metal, paper, and photograph. The coins were tangible wealth, yes, but it was the narrative intertwined with them, the moral weight, the personal story that anchored their attention. Jacob's mind wandered to their own struggles. The months without work, the nights spent sleeping on the seat of the truck, the weight of debt pressing against their ribs. Lila, meanwhile, seemed to exist in 2 times at once, present, chipping away at dust, and past imagining the desert life of the man and girl, the journeys recorded meticulously in the journal, the careful hiding of objects meant to endure decades. Neither spoke much after a while. Words felt unnecessary against the gravity of discovery. Dust clung to their clothes and skin, and the desert light shifted through the doorway, illuminating the gold in streaks that seemed almost sacramental. Jacob ran his fingers over the coins once more, feeling the cold metal bite through his skin. He imagined the long journey these coins had made, the hands that had touched them, the sands and heat that had worn them smooth. Lila flipped the journal closed with care, setting it gently atop the coins. Her fingers lingered on the photograph. "Do you think they ever made it back?" she asked softly. Jacob shook his head. "I don't know, but someone wanted us to find this." The moment held a peculiar stillness, a suspended sense of anticipation. Outside the unit, the world moved on, as it always did. Cars past wind rattled the metal doors, the distant hum of traffic persisted. But inside, Jacob and Lila existed in the fragile intersection of past and present, holding the echoes of lives that had been hidden for centuries. They knew that the gold was only a part of the story, that the photograph and journal were equally precious in their own way. Lila traced the initials EC once more on the photograph, whispering the name, as though speaking aloud might make the story come alive. Jacob rested his hand lightly on hers. "Whatever comes next," he said, "will be ready." And even as they spoke, the air in the unit seemed to hold its breath, as if the past itself were waiting for them to take the next step to uncover the secrets that lay beneath the dust, the hidden paths that... After securing the heavy box, Jacob and Lila drove in silence toward the storage facility's office, the journal and coins resting carefully on the passenger seat. The morning air was dry and sharp, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Jacob parked and stepped inside the linoleum floor, squeaking beneath his boots. Janet, the manager, looked up from her desk, adjusting her glasses. "Back for more treasure hunting?" she asked lightly. Jacob shook his head. "We need records." "Who rented Unit 48 before us?" Janet typed quickly into the old computer. "Edward Carraway," she said, reading aloud. "History teacher, retired, rented this unit for nearly 5 years, paid faithfully, last record in June last year. Passed away in a retirement home. No listed family." Lila's breath caught. No family at all. Janet shook her head. "None we could find. Quiet man. Very organized. Spent time collecting historical documents, coins, and artifacts. Left instructions for nothing in particular. Just preservation." Jacob exchanged a glance with Lila. "Preservation?" He murmured, "That sounds familiar." Lila held the journal tighter, running her fingers over the faded handwriting. Janet continued. "Some residents remember him mentioning La Grecia. Said whoever found it should bring it to the Mesa del Silencio. He described it like it was sacred." Jacob frowned. "Mesa del Silencio?" Janet nodded. "He called it the Plateau of Silence. Said the sun dies there. He believed if La Gracia reached it, history would remember what was lost and preserved. He studied lost Spanish expeditions that vanished in the Nevada desert, traveled alone, spent decades mapping landmarks." Lila's eyes widened. "He wanted this treasure returned there." Janet nodded slowly. He made notes, sketched maps, described landmarks, wrote detailed instructions. He always said no one else should meddle until it reached the right hands. He believed in legacy and responsibility. Jacob and Lila left the office, walking across the lot where the sunlight bounced harshly off the metal doors. The coins, journal, and photograph now carried weight beyond material value. They were part of someone's careful plan, a charge left to them. Jacob slid into the truck. "Mesa del Silencio," he murmured, testing the words aloud. Lila traced the initials EC on the journal, imagining Edward standing in the desert, hoping someone worthy would follow his guidance. They drove for hours, consulting the journal's sketches and notes, comparing vague references to distant hills and mountains with the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, ochre and sage blending into the haze. Lila imagined the man in the photograph standing with the little girl, guiding her hand across the arid terrain, leaving signs and maps that would survive decades. Jacob's fingers tapped the dashboard, each beat echoing a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He glanced at her. "Do you think he expected us?" Lila shrugged unsure eyes, lingering on the leather-bound journal, as if reading Edward's intentions directly from the pages. They reached the town nearest the high plains, where the plateau was said to rise. The retirement home was modest paint, peeling a small garden blooming defiantly under the harsh sun. An elderly nurse, Martha, greeted them, hands wrinkled and steady despite her age. She remembered Edward well. He always said she began, if someone found La Gracia, they had to carry it to Mesa del Silencio. He spoke of it like it was sacred ground, a place where the past could rest. He spent years researching lost Spanish expeditions, mapping landmarks, surviving alone in the desert. He believed the treasure would only fulfill its purpose if it arrived there. Lila clutched the journal to her chest. "Why there?" she asked softly. Martha's eyes softened. He said it was where the sun sets over everything we've lost, where the desert preserves history. It's dangerous, remote, and silent. He believed only someone patient and careful could follow through. Jacob leaned against the wall, thinking of the long road ahead. "Right hands," he murmured, echoing Martha's words. Lila traced the photograph again, imagining Edward guiding the little girl across the Nevada plateau, wind whipping at their clothing, their faces lined with resolve. She thought of the coins, the journal, and the message etched in faded ink, connecting the past to their present, demanding care and respect. The responsibility weighed heavily on them both. These were not simple relics, but the culmination of a life spent preserving history, a charge to honor someone's decades of work. The desert beyond the town was quiet, and sprawling mesas, rising like ancient guardians against the sky. Lila spread the journal across her lap, as Jacob drove tracing the sketches of formations, annotations, and cryptic notes about lost expeditions. Each mark carried meaning, a breadcrumb trail left by a man who had trusted them without knowing them. Jacob imagined the years Edward had spent alone in the desert, cataloging, observing, preparing for the moment someone would come. And now that someone was them. As they parked outside the old highway near the edge of town, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the desert. Lila opened the journal again, studying the careful pencil sketches of ridges, canyons, and mesas, imagining Edward and the little girl moving silently among them, leaving marks and notes that only the diligent could follow. Jacob stared out at the horizon, the wind tugging at the edges of the journal, and felt the weight of the responsibility they now carried. They had the coins, the photograph, the journal, and Edward's trust, and they understood in a quiet, sinking way that the next steps would take them into the vast unknown, to a plateau where history and treasure intertwined, to a place where the sun dies and La Gracia awaited. Jacob and Lila woke before sunrise. The desert horizon painted in muted oranges and pinks, the kind of early light that made the air shimmer even before the sun broke fully over the cliffs. They had made a decision overnight, one that carried both risk and hope. The old Ford truck, their lifeline for years, was gone. They had sold it to a man in town who appreciated the rust and dents for what it was trading it for, an aging four-wheel drive vehicle, a battered Jeep that had seen too many miles but promised mobility over the uneven Nevada terrain. The engine groaned as they packed the coins, journal, and photograph securely in the back, along with water containers and supplies enough for only 2 days. Lila spread out the sketches from Edward's journal across the dashboard, tracing the pencil lines with her finger as Jacob started the engine. "This is it," he said quietly. "No turning back." The first day's drive was merciless. The sun rose fast, baking the highway, and the desert beyond the thermometer climbing to 46 degrees Celsius by midday. Every mile was a test of patience, the tires crunching against sand and gravel, the heat reflecting off the metal surfaces of the Jeep, making the air shimmer. Jacob's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened the vibrations of the old suspension, shaking through his arms. Lila monitored their water supply, obsessively refilling small bottles and rationing sips to make the 2-day supply last. "We have to pace ourselves," she said. "Desert doesn't forgive mistakes." Jacob nodded, silent, letting the Jeep carry them forward while his thoughts wandered to the photograph. He imagined Edward tall and solemn, leading the little girl across the same heat, leaving subtle marks for anyone who might follow. As evening fell, the desert shifted. Shadows lengthened over sand dunes and rocky ridges, and the air cooled just enough for them to breathe without feeling their lungs sear. They pulled off the road to set up a small campsite, stretching a tarp over the jeep's back and placing their supplies in a neat row. Lila examined the journal by flashlight, her finger tracing the contours of distant mesas and canyons. Jacob wandered a few steps away, letting the silence of the desert settle around him. The weight of the journey pressed on them, the harsh heat. Minimal water and isolation had already begun to test the limits of both endurance and courage. On the second day, the jeep shuddered violently as it climbed a narrow ridge, coughing and sputtering until it died, entirely leaving them stranded in an expanse of sand and rock. The desert sun was relentless, and the few containers of water they had left felt unbearably scarce. Jacob and Lila unloaded what they could carry, setting up a makeshift shade with a torn blanket from their supplies. The thought of sleeping under the stars in the open desert brought a quiet fear, yet also a strange clarity. Jacob lay back on the coarse sand, staring at the sky as darkness began to fall, the first stars flickering like distant fireflies. "If we die here," he said softly, "at least we're together." Lila shifted beside him, her cheek dusty from the sand, lips cracked from dehydration, yet her smile was steady and full of resolve. "No," she said, her voice gentle. "If there's really gold, we'll build a library in his name. That's how we honor him." They settled under the stars, listening to the wind whisper across the dunes and the distant call of desert wildlife. The photograph of Edward and the girl rested between them, the journal open to sketches of mesas and distant landmarks. The desert night was cold despite the day's heat, and the sand underneath them offered little comfort, yet they lay awake, each consumed by thoughts of what lay ahead. The moon rose slowly, casting a silver light across the barren landscape, illuminating ridges and valleys, the vast openness emphasizing their smallness, their vulnerability. Yet in that same openness lay possibility, the sense that discovery waited for those willing to endure. Lila unwrapped the journal and flipped to a page showing the rough outline of the plateau, annotated with small marks for water sources and paths. "Look," she said, pointing to the notes he planned everything. "It's like he knew someone would come." Jacob nodded, examining the sketches and comparing them to the landscape around them. Every ridge, every incline, and every dip in the terrain seemed to echo Edward's careful markings, proof that someone had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. They felt the enormity of the responsibility that had been passed to them, not just to find the treasure, but to honor the intent of the man who had risked so much. As the night deepened, they spoke little, conserving strength and energy for what remained. The gold coins and the journal were secure in the backpack between them, a tangible weight of history pressing against their ribs, reminding them that this was not merely an adventure. It was a pilgrimage into the unknown, a journey into the desert that tested both endurance and morality. Jacob listened to Lila's soft breathing, the wind stirring the sand around them, and felt a fragile peace. The stars above seemed to stretch endlessly, mirroring the vast journey ahead. In that quiet, the desert became both adversary and guide, harsh and unforgiving, yet protective in its solitude. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, washing the sand in soft amber, Jacob and Lila sat up, eyes tracing the distant mesas outlined against the sky. They knew the day would be long, the desert heat unrelenting, and the challenges ahead formidable. Yet beneath that knowledge was a pulse of determination, a quiet courage born of having nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The photograph of Edward and the girl rested between them, a reminder that they were not merely chasing treasure. They were continuing a story that had begun long before their arrival, and whose resolution depended on their endurance, their judgment, and their heart. The desert stretched endlessly before them, ridges and canyons fading into the haze, the path to Mesa del Silencio marked only by Edward's meticulous notes and the twins' determination. Water was scarce, supplies limited, and the sun promised an unyielding day ahead. Yet the stars they had slept under seemed to whisper encouragement, as if the desert itself had acknowledged their presence. The first climb toward the plateau was visible in the distance, shadowed by rocks and cliffs, the wind carrying the faint scent of sage and stone. Their journey had begun in earnest, and each step, each mile, each glance at the sketches and coins pressed them closer to the unknown, toward a place where history, treasure, and human endurance would collide under the Nevada sun. The third morning dawned with an eerie clarity, the sun rising over the jagged mesas of Nevada, casting long, sharp shadows across the plateau of Mesa del Silencio. The air was thin and dry, carrying the faint scent of sandstone and sagebrush, a stillness that pressed against Jacob and Lila with the weight of centuries. The plateau stretched out before them, winds whispering across its ridges like ghostly voices, the quiet so absolute it made their own footsteps seem unbearably loud. Jacob guided the jeep along a narrow, rocky track, each wheel crunching against gravel and fractured stone, the tires skimming over ridges that seemed to rise and fall like the back of some massive, dormant creature. Lila traced Edward's sketches against the ridges, comparing them to the real contours before her, noting the small marks he had made for rock formations and shallow gullies. "We're close," she whispered more to herself than to Jacob. By mid-morning, they reached the heart of the plateau, a narrow canyon opening that matched the description in Edward's journal, cliffs towering over 50 feet, casting deep shadows that hid their entrance in semi-darkness. The wind carried the faint scent of minerals and dust, stirring loose pebbles across the sand, and Jacob turned off the engine, letting the jeep settle in the silence. They stepped out the heat, pressing down, but tempered by the chill that came from shade between the cliffs. Lila moved ahead, eyes scanning the stone walls with the meticulous attention of someone who had spent hours studying pencil sketches in the dim light of their makeshift campsite. The plateau's vast openness contrasted with the intimacy of the canyon, and every small noise the scrape of a rock. The whisper of wind felt amplified, as though history itself was holding its breath. As they progressed deeper into the canyon, Lila noticed a carved symbol etched into a flat stone face, partially hidden by overgrowth. Her heart skipped. It was unmistakable, a broken-winged angel, the very same symbol that had adorned the Spanish coins in the box. She reached out, brushing away the accumulated dust and sand. The carvings were delicate, precise, unmistakably human, and aligned perfectly with the markings Edward had sketched in his journal. Jacob knelt beside her, studying the carvings. "This is it," he murmured. "This is the place he meant." Lila nodded, feeling the hairs on her arms lift, a shiver running down her spine, as though the desert itself acknowledged their arrival. The symbol was both warning and invitation, guiding them towards something that had waited centuries to be found. Beneath the carved angel, a narrow fissure in the rock caught Lila's attention. It was barely wide enough for her hand, yet it descended vertically into shadow, cold air rising up to brush their faces with a damp, earthy chill. Jacob shone the flashlight into the crevice, revealing only darkness at first. But as they adjusted their angle, hundreds of reflective surfaces flickered in the beam. Lila's mouth went dry. "Silver," she breathed. Or something like it. They shifted closer, peering down into the gap. At the bottom lay a burial chamber, a small vaulted space cut into the rock centuries ago, containing wooden chests wrapped in oilcloth, glinting with silver and scattered statuettes of saints. Candles had long since rotted, leaving wax stains and scorched edges on the stone floor, a silent testament to devotion, or perhaps desperation. Jacob lowered a rope, while Lila tied her pack securely. The descent was slow and cautious, the air growing colder with each step. The chamber smelled faintly of Earth Age, and something indefinably metallic. They moved carefully, flashlights illuminating chests bound with iron and silver, delicate statuettes of saints, with expressions of sorrow and grace and scattered coins that mirrored the designs in Edward's collection. Every object seemed untouched by modern hands, preserved in reverence for decades, centuries even. They exchanged a glance, recognizing the significance of what they had uncovered. This was a place of both wealth and remembrance, a hidden repository of faith, history, and personal sacrifice. But as Lila's light swept over the far corner of the chamber, she froze. There, propped against a small stone ledge, lay a skeletal figure, diminutive in size, curled as if asleep. The bones were fragile teeth still intact. In a small jaw, the skull tilted slightly, hair long and matted. Lila swallowed her throat tight. Jacob followed her gaze, his voice barely a whisper. The girl. He didn't finish. It was unmistakable, the child in the black and white photograph decades past death, now resting in the very place Edward had hinted they would find her. Lila reached out to touch the skeletal hand, closing her eyes as a lump rose in her throat. She waited here, she said softly, voice breaking centuries, for someone to remember. Jacob knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. It's like Edward said, he murmured. The grace isn't the gold, it's what we lost looking for it. And we found it. Not just the treasure, but her. History. Their story. Lila's fingers lingered on the bones, tracing the delicate curve of the child's wrist, imagining Edward and the little girl standing in the Nevada sun, leaving subtle clues that would survive the harshest years. Tears gathered in her eyes, blurring the glinting silver in the light. We'll honor them, she whispered. Every bit of this, every coin, every statue, every memory. Jacob stood shining his flashlight over the rows of chests, again taking in the scale of the hidden chamber. Every detail, the carved angels, the worn coins, the scattered religious artifacts, spoke of meticulous care, of someone who had poured decades into ensuring that the story survived, even if its characters did not. The desert wind stirred faintly in the chamber, carrying with it a sense of expectancy, as if the past itself had leaned forward to acknowledge the presence of those who had arrived at last. Lila set down the journal, opening it to the page, with the sketch of the broken winged angel matching it to the carving before them. She traced the lines carefully. This is where everything comes together. Hours passed as they explored the chamber, arranging coins, photographing the silver and statuettes, and making careful notes of the spatial layout mirroring Edward's meticulous record-keeping. The child's skeletal remains remained untouched, sacred and quiet, yet central to understanding the history they had stumbled into. Lila whispered a prayer, unsure if anyone could hear her, unsure if words mattered. The air felt thick with stories waiting to be told, and they both realized they were no longer merely seekers of treasure. They were custodians of a history that demanded respect, compassion, and preservation. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the chamber, silver flickering in the low light, and the wind moaned through the crevices above, carrying with it a faint memory of the desert and the centuries of silence it had held. Jacob and Lila sat against the wall, resting their shoulders, understanding the depth of what they had found: wealth, history, devotion, and tragedy, all intertwined in this silent, sacred place. The weight of responsibility pressed on them, mingling with awe and grief, knowing that the decisions they made in the next hours would determine whether these stories survived intact. They exchanged a glance, silent agreement passing between them, aware that their journey had only just begun, and that the past had much more to reveal as they descended deeper into the shadows of history. Jacob and Lila carefully opened one of the wooden chests, its iron straps still tight despite centuries in the damp chamber. Inside, along with the silver ingots and religious statuettes, lay a small envelope sealed in hardened wax, its crimson surface cracked but intact. Lila held it reverently, brushing away centuries of dust and trembling as she broke the seal. The paper inside was brittle, faintly scented of old parchment and the faintest hint of candle smoke. Written in delicate looping script was a note signed, Padre Diego Caraway, 1742. The name made Lila pause. Caraway, the same surname as Edward. Her fingers traced the elegant curves of the letters, her pulse quickening. She handed the letter to Jacob, whose brow furrowed as he read aloud, his voice catching slightly. When the plague came, Jacob began, I buried the church's wealth here with my only daughter to prevent its theft. May God forgive the one who traded life for faith. Lila gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. The words reverberated through the chamber, the weight of centuries pressing down on them like a physical force. Jacob lowered the letter, his eyes meeting Lila's. "This isn't about gold," he whispered, voice thick with awe. "It's about survival, devotion, and sacrifice. Edward, he spent his life trying to honor this act. He tracked it, preserved it, and hid it so no one could misuse it." Lila's eyes glistened, tears forming unbidden. She could see the image of the priest, a man making impossible choices during a plague, choosing faith and family over wealth, burying treasures to protect them from those who would exploit others' suffering. Lila pressed her hand to the chest, feeling the wood grain beneath her fingers, imagining Padre Diego standing over the chests with his young daughter at his side, shrouded in the dust of a world dying around them. The thought of the child, small and fragile, being laid to rest beside the treasure brought an ache to her chest. Jacob noticed the subtle tremor in her shoulders and reached out, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "She wasn't lost," he said softly. "She was protected, remembered." And Edward, he made it his life's mission to complete what Padre Diego started. Lila's tears fell freely now, not for the treasure of silver, but for the lineage of devotion and love threaded through the generations, for the men and women who sacrificed so much to preserve something sacred. They sat in silence, the chamber around them heavy with history. The angels carved into the stone seemed to watch their broken wings, symbolic of endurance, of survival against impossible odds. The silver coins reflected the flashlight in scattered glimmers, yet their luster now felt secondary to the human story contained within these walls. Lila opened the journal, searching for notes Edward had made during his years of research, and found precise sketches overlaying the sketches of mountains and mesas, lines connecting locations of artifacts to the crevice and the chamber. She realized that Edward had devoted decades to retracing his ancestors' path, carefully documenting every symbol, every formation, every marker, so that one day someone worthy could finally witness the truth. Jacob gently lifted one of the silver statuettes, studying it closely. Its features, while worn, held a solemnity and devotion that made his chest tighten. "He didn't do this for money," he said, voice low. "Edward wasn't searching for wealth. He was looking for closure, for redemption, for family. That's the La Gracia he was chasing." Lila nodded, tears streaking across her cheeks. "It's grace," she whispered. "It's not the treasure. It's what you do to honor the past, to make right what once went wrong." Padre Diego gave everything his daughter, his wealth, so faith and memory could survive. Edward spent his life making sure no one forgot. They began carefully cataloging the contents, photographing each piece, noting placement and condition, aware that the historical record was as important as the treasure itself. The chest contained small crucifixes, a rosary with beads of silver, and faded pages of hymnals, each piece meticulously preserved. Lila unfolded the photograph once more, the image of Edward and the child now overlaying the letter they had just read. She imagined the girl's eyes looking up at her father, the silent fear and trust entwined in her expression, and felt a deep ache in her chest for the sacrifices of 2 lifetimes. Jacob moved closer, reading passages from the journal aloud, and each sentence wove together the story of loss, duty, and redemption, spanning more than 3 centuries. As they worked, the air in the chamber seemed charged with the past. The faint breeze carrying dust across the room carried also a weight of memory and quiet reverence, the sense that these were not merely objects, but the embodiment of moral decisions, of human vulnerability, of faith and protection in the face of insurmountable odds. Lila's hands shook as she lifted the wax-sealed letter again, holding it against her heart. This is what he meant," she whispered. "La Gracia isn't gold, it's grace. It's what we do to preserve what others risked everything to protect." Jacob placed a hand on her shoulder again, and together they knelt before the chest, imagining Padre Diego and his daughter, imagining Edward following every trace of their lives, protecting, documenting, living quietly with the weight of history on his shoulders. The silver reflected in their flashlights, the carved angels above, and the skeletal remains in the corner, all combined into a tableau that transcended mere treasure hunting. It was about duty, continuity, and memory, Lila's tears fell freely now, wetting the pages of Edward's journal, smudging pencil lines, yet somehow making the story more real, more immediate, more alive. Hours passed in quiet reflection. They moved slowly, reverently touching photographing and cataloging. Each coin, statuette, and letter was a testament to sacrifice and devotion, yet the true discovery lay in understanding what had driven Edward's life and Padre Diego's fateful decisions. Lila stared at the skeletal remains, imagining the child's short life, imagining the choice between hiding and fleeing, and felt both sorrow and awe. The past was no longer distant. It pressed upon them, demanding acknowledgement and careful action. Finally, as dusk began to seep into the chamber, casting long silver shadows across the stone floor, Jacob closed the letter and laid it gently back in the chest. Lila pressed her hand to the coins, the statuettes and the letters, her mind replaying the words over and over. La Gracia, she said softly, voice thick with emotion. Not gold, not silver, not wealth. Grace, redemption, memory. That's what we carry forward. Jacob nodded, the enormity of their responsibility settling over him, like the desert night, a quiet determination binding them to the duty Edward had left them. The silence of Mesa del Silencio enveloped them almost as if it were listening, acknowledging and waiting for the next step of their journey. Jacob and Lila had just left the edge of Mesa del Silencio, their jeep rattling along the narrow dirt track leading back toward the nearest small town, the journal and silver carefully packed behind them. The desert sun hung low, casting long shadows across the dunes, and each mile carried with it a heavy mix of relief and lingering fear. Their thoughts were still with the skeletal remains, the letter from Padre Diego, and Edward Carraway's decades of meticulous research. Jacob glanced at Lila as she drove the faint dust smudges across her cheeks, accentuating the worry in her eyes. "We need to get to the authorities," he said quietly, "so these things are protected, so no one can misuse them." Lila nodded, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening. "I just hope we're not too late," she whispered, scanning the horizon for the approaching town. The road ahead was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the jeep's engine and the faint rustle of wind carrying sand across rocks. As they approached a narrow pass between two low mesas, movement ahead caught Jacob's eye. 3 figures stepped into the track, blocking their path with an intimidating presence. Each man was tall, muscular, and dressed in rugged outdoor gear, their faces partially obscured by sunglasses and scarves. One stepped forward, a crooked grin on his face. "Going somewhere?" he asked, voice rough with confidence. Jacob instinctively slowed the vehicle. "We're just heading to town," he replied cautiously. Lila's hands tensed around the steering wheel. The tallest of the 3 men leaned against the jeep, blocking any attempt to drive past. "We heard about you," he said, "about what you found up there. The treasure, the silver, the coins. Where did you hide it?" Lila felt her stomach tighten. We don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man laughed a low, mocking sound. "Don't play dumb. We're the prospectors. We've been tracking that stash for years. You've got 2 choices. Tell us what you found, or..." He let the threat hang in the air, the implied violence unmistakable. Jacob's chest tightened as he realized the danger they faced. The men advanced, circling the jeep with practiced ease. Lila instinctively locked the doors, but the thud of boots against metal sent her heart racing. "How much did you take?" one demanded. "Where is it buried? Hand it over and maybe we'll let you leave with your lives." Jacob opened the door, trying to reason with them. "It's not just treasure. It's historical artifacts, letters, documents. It belongs in a museum." The men sneered. "A museum doesn't matter to us. We want it all. Coin, silver, the works. Now." Before Jacob could react, a fist struck him across the face, sending pain through his nose as he fell back onto the seat. He tried to stand, but another blow left him dazed and bloody. Lila shouted, clutching the journal and the box of coins, but one of the men ripped them from her hands. The weight of betrayal and fear pressed on her chest as she realized they had lost the very evidence they needed to protect. No, she screamed, but the men ignored her cries, shoving her toward the edge of a steep, shallow ravine. Instinct and training from their desert survival days kicked in. Lila clutched the journal to her chest as she stumbled backward, Jacob bleeding but trying to steady himself beside her. One of the men grabbed her arm, twisting it roughly, trying to snatch the journal again. Desperation surged through her. She reached down to her worn boot and felt the small memory card she had slipped inside that morning, hidden carefully beneath the insole of her shoe. She pressed it against her palm, feeling the tiny plastic rectangle against her fingertips. Even if they lost the physical journal and coins, the photographs she had taken of the chest, the silver, and Padre Diego's letter were safe. The men were growing impatient, jostling them both, demanding answers, cursing under their breath. Jacob, bleeding from his nose, could barely stand, but he moved to shield Lila even as the two of them were pushed closer to the drop. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows that made the cliffs and ravine edges appear steeper, more menacing. "Give us everything, or you won't leave alive." The tallest man hissed his hand, gripping Lila's shoulder. With trembling hands, Lila pressed her toes against the edge of the Jeep floorboard and twisted slightly, slipping the memory card fully into the shoe while keeping her fingers curled tightly around the journal. The men were unaware. Jacob gritted his teeth, taking a shallow, steadying breath through the pain in his nose. He tried to reason again, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand what this is. It's not just treasure." A sudden shove sent both of them stumbling dangerously close to the ravine edge. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that one wrong step could end everything. The men laughed cruelly, imagining the treasure in their hands, blind to the resilience of their quarry. One yanked the journal from Lila again, while another pried the box of coins from the Jeep seat. Panic surged. "Stop!" Lila cried, but it was futile. Jacob tried to hold them off, but the blows were relentless. Each second stretched impossibly long, the desert sun painting the scene in harsh gold and red, reflecting off the rocks, and the silver glinting in the box, now in the prospector's hands. Despite the overwhelming fear and pain, Lila felt a surge of determination. She pressed her foot firmly against the sole of her shoe, feeling the hidden memory card secure a lifeline containing all the photographs, all the proof of the treasure's contents, and the letter from Padre Diego. Even if the men took everything else, that small, overlooked object could preserve the truth. As they were shoved closer to the ravine, the wind tugged at their hair and closed the canyon's emptiness, amplifying their vulnerability, yet somehow the tiny secret in Lila's shoe became a beacon of hope. Jacob was battered, blood streaming down his face, but he forced himself to stay upright, keeping his weight between the men and Lila. The prospectors, triumphant with the journal and coins, prepared to push them into the shallow drop. Lila's hand lingered on her concealed memory card, and a cold resolve settled over her. Whatever happened next, the evidence would survive hidden in plain sight, and the story they had uncovered, the story of Padre Diego Edward, and the child would not be lost, no matter the cruelty they faced. The desert wind whispered across the canyon as the men closed in their laughter, echoing against the rock walls. Lila's pulse raced, the sun lowering the sky to deep amber and violet. She glanced at Jacob, who gave a faint nod, despite the blood on his face, a silent acknowledgement of the peril and the bond that had carried them through months of hardship. In that moment, the weight of responsibility, fear, and hope converged, and though they were beaten, bruised, and on the brink, a single hidden memory card held the key to preserving everything. Jacob and Lila stumbled through the heat-hazed desert for what felt like endless hours, the blows from the prospectors burning on Jacob's face, his nose swollen and bleeding. Lila's arms aching from the struggle to keep both herself and the journal safe. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the coarse sand biting at their ankles and the fading sun casting long shadows that stretched across the dunes like dark fingers. The memory of the skeletal child, the silver chests, and Padre Diego's letter weighed on Lila, mingling with the sharp sting of adrenaline and fear. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm them, a faint, steady whistle drifted across the canyon wind, cutting through the silence with a human note that seemed impossibly hopeful. Lila squinted toward the source, and out of the haze emerged a figure, slender, stooped, but moving with a confident surety over the shifting desert terrain. The man approached slowly, his face lined with age, the sun illuminating the weathered features of someone who had lived a lifetime under these skies. His clothing was simple but practical, a hand-woven blanket draped over one shoulder, and moccasins gripping the desert stones. "You two need help," he said in a low, calm voice that seemed to blend with the rustle of the wind. Jacob collapsed to his knees, unable to speak through the pain and shock, and Lila's arms dropped to her sides, trembling. The man extended a hand, helping them steady themselves. "I'm Enoch," he said. "Navajo. I know these lands. Come with me. You're not safe out here alone." He led them carefully along a hidden trail, winding through jagged rocks and sparse vegetation, the way known only to someone who had spent decades reading the desert like a living map. Jacob leaned heavily on Enoch, the blood on his face congealing in the afternoon heat, while Lila kept her eyes forward, alert to every movement in the rocks and shadows. Enoch did not rush them. His steps deliberate, and he spoke in short, measured sentences. "The desert tests you," he said, "and it shows what you carry inside. People who seek treasure with greed lose more than they imagine. You," he glanced at the bruised and exhausted pair, "have preserved your spirits, but don't take it lightly." By twilight, they arrived at a small wooden cabin nestled among a cluster of juniper trees. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the scent of sage lingered in the air. Enoch guided them inside, where the warmth and shade offered immediate relief. He helped Jacob sit and gently examined his injuries, wrapping his swollen nose and cuts with strips of cloth, murmuring advice and encouragement as he worked. Lila watched him, awe mingled with gratitude. The old man's hands were steady, strong, yet gentle, and there was a quiet authority in the way he cared for them. "You've survived because you respect what you found," Enoch said. "Those who seek without thought lose everything, sometimes life itself. Remember, the gold is nothing if it costs your soul." Lila nodded, understanding both the warning and the wisdom in his words, feeling the weight of what they had preserved and what might have been lost. That night they rested, the cool desert wind whispering against the cabin walls, bringing relief to battered bodies and weary minds. In the dim light of the small lantern, Lila pulled the memory card from her shoe and studied it once more, ensuring every image of the silver chests, coin statuettes, and Padre Diego's letter had been captured. She could see the faint gleam of the metal, the careful arrangement of objects, and the skeletal remains of the child. Each photograph a testament to history, preserved proof that their ordeal was not in vain. Jacob, bruised but conscious, watched her with quiet pride, the bond between them strengthened by the trials they had endured. The next morning, with the sun climbing over the distant ridges, Lila and Jacob drove the few remaining miles to the small town, Enoch accompanying them as a witness. At the local police station, she handed over the memory card, explaining the contents and the chain of events that had led to this moment. Jacob recounted the assault and the theft of the journal and coins, the officers listening with growing gravity. Enoch stood by silently, his presence lending weight to their testimony, speaking briefly of the desert, the plateau, and the evidence of care and intention in Edward Carraway's work. The officers studied the photographs on the card, the images of chests, coins, and the wax-sealed letter, the skeletal remains, and the carved angel in the rock. Recognition dawned on their faces. These were artifacts of immense historical and cultural significance, far beyond mere treasure. Meanwhile, news of the attempted sale of the stolen coins in Las Vegas reached local authorities. Within days, officers coordinated with federal agencies to intercept the three men from the prospectors, who had underestimated both the vigilance of law enforcement and the importance of Lila's preserved evidence. The men were apprehended at a pawn shop in the city, trying to negotiate the sale of the coins, unaware that their movements had been tracked and their intentions documented. Lila and Jacob's memory card, coupled with Enoch's testimony, proved crucial in establishing the men's knowledge of and intent to steal significant historical artifacts. Back in the quiet of the desert town, Jacob cleaned his wounds as Lila spoke with officers, providing additional details and descriptions, her mind replaying the harrowing moments when they had nearly lost everything. Enoch remained a calm presence, reminding them that while the danger had passed, the responsibility of preserving history remained. "You did right," he said, eyes steady, "and that matters more than the gold. Never forget what is preserved with care and respect outlives those who seek only wealth." Lila nodded the enormity of their survival, and the justice achieved settling over her. The sun climbed higher, and the desert outside seemed to sigh, as if acknowledging that balance had been restored, at least for now. Jacob and Lila left the police station with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph. The silver coins, the journal, and the letter were no longer solely theirs, yet their role in preserving history was undeniable. Enoch guided them back toward the edge of the desert, sharing stories of ancestral traditions and desert survival, the wisdom of patience, and the enduring power of human morality. Each step they took reinforced the lessons learned. Courage, integrity, and care for the past mattered more than the immediate lure of wealth. The ordeal had tested them, broken them, and yet strengthened them, leaving them both humbled and resolute, ready to continue honoring the legacy they had uncovered. 6 months had passed since Jacob and Lila first uncovered the hidden treasures at Mesa del Silencio. The Nevada authorities, working with historians and archaeologists, had conducted a careful excavation of the site. Every chest coin and artifact was documented, measured, and preserved, including the skeletal remains of the child. Jacob and Lila, invited as witnesses, watched quietly as professionals handled each item with reverence, understanding the importance of context and history. Edward Carraway's journal had guided them to the exact locations, and the photographs Lila had taken became critical evidence confirming the findings. The air was filled with the dry desert heat and a sense of solemnity, as if the plateau itself acknowledged the centuries of sacrifice that had taken place there. The wooden chests were lifted with cranes onto padded tables, their iron straps intact despite decades underground. Archaeologists carefully opened them, revealing silver ingots, religious statuettes, and coins with intricate Spanish designs. The wax-sealed letter from Padre Diego Carraway was handled gently, the script preserved for study and eventual display. Jacob watched, feeling a mix of awe and humility. The skeletal remains were placed into protective containers, and Lila pressed her hands together, whispering a silent prayer for the child and for the priest who had sacrificed so much to hide and protect the treasure. The site was formally recognized as an 18th century religious and cultural monument, a protected heritage site honoring Padre Diego and his daughter. Jacob and Lila walked among the markers placed by archaeologists, reading the inscriptions that recounted the priest's courage, the child's tragic fate, and Edward's decades-long search for remembrance. Lila's hand lingered on a carved angel in the stone familiar from the coin design, and she felt a gentle warmth, imagining that the desert itself was acknowledging their commitment to preserve the truth. A shared tombstone had been placed for Padre Diego and his daughter, engraved with the words from Edward's journal, "An hui kong nam ovang bak matrong nhung gita dan mat ki ditim no." Lila read it aloud to the assembled team and officials, her voice trembling but clear. Jacob stood beside her, his hands stained from months of desert work and long days documenting the site, feeling a deep, quiet pride. The words resonated. The treasure was never gold or silver. It was memory duty and the grace of preserving what others had risked everything to protect. The compensation from the museum was modest enough to replace their Jeep, but Jacob and Lila cared little for money. The reward for them was the preservation of history and the opportunity to honor a legacy. They used part of it to establish the La Gracia Fund, offering scholarships to children from low-income families so they could pursue education. The fund's mission reflected the values of Padre Diego and Edward Carraway, transforming historical preservation into tangible opportunities for the next generation. Lila imagined classrooms filled with eager students, learning not just history, but the lessons of courage, integrity, and perseverance. During the library opening in the small desert town, children crowded around the exhibits, eager to see the reproduced coins photographs and excerpts from Edward's journal. Lila's voice, filled with emotion, addressed the gathering. Padre Caraway never found his treasure, she said, tears glistening. But because of him, 2 children who had nothing learned that treasure is more than gold. It's faith, memory, and courage, Jacob added softly. And now you have the chance to discover your own treasure, not in silver, but in knowledge and hope. The library's shelves were lined with books and small displays of replicated artifacts connecting the past with the present. Children asked questions about survival history and the sacrifices of those who came before them. Jacob and Lila spent hours walking among them, answering, guiding, and sharing stories. Each smile and question reinforced the lesson they had learned. The truest treasure was in preservation, respect, and the passing of knowledge across generations. As the sun set over the desert, Lila looked at the distant mesas, thinking of Padre Diego Edward and the child whose life had been intertwined with theirs through history. She whispered to Jacob, "He never found his treasure, but we did, and now these children can find theirs." Jacob nodded, his heart full. They understood now that the treasure they had uncovered was not measured in silver or gold, but in the courage to protect, the wisdom to preserve, and the grace to share it with others. The desert wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust, and the library stood as a beacon of hope and history. Jacob and Lila felt the culmination of their journey. The fear, the pain, the courage, and the responsibility coalesce into something far greater than themselves. La Gracia was real, not in wealth, but in legacy, in faith preserved, and in lives transformed. The treasure was no longer hidden. It lived in the hearts of those who would carry its lessons forward, a testament to human endurance, love, and grace. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible adventures like this one. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And which part of the story surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.